Another important feature in less is the ability to create nested rules. Typically, when we're looking at CSS, if we want something to have a complex rule set, we need to specify the full name and subname of the rule we want to find. In CSS, the more specificity, the more likely it is going to be used. And so having some specificity in some cases becomes pretty important. Reading them in CSS becomes a problem because we tend to have to repeat the same information over and over and over again to get these different rules. Less allows us to nest these to imply this. This allows your structure to imply what those relationships between the different rules are in a logical way. The hierarchy implies this cascading and specificity of your rules, and then we'll go ahead and create the CSS, the correct CSS, based on that nesting. So in CSS, we can see here where we have a nav section. Inside the nav section, there's a unordered list, and then there's an unordered list item underneath it. And as we look at this, we can see that nav is repeated in all three, and then we have to repeat the unordered list in both of those cases as well. If we change this to the less nested rules, we can see that we have a nav section that still has rules that are specific to the nav, but then it has a nested element called UL that will then have lists of items that are specific to the unordered list, and then inside it will have the list item itself with the rules that apply to it. When it is compiled, it dereferences the nesting to create the same CSS that you're used to seeing, except this makes a more logical way to maintain these rules over time. Another key to nested rules that can be important at times is to use something that they call the combinator. The expectation here is that there are some rules that when you put them together, they need to be, in fact, combined with the parent. Anchor tags are a typical place for this. So if you have an anchor rule that says get rid of the text decoration, but I want to unhover, make the underline reappear, this ampersand here says when you mix this with the A in generating the CSS, make sure that the hover is just next to the A, that we're not separating them with spaces. It actually becomes a single tag for the rule in the CSS. Let's see how this works. So here in our original less file that contains the original CSS from our project, we can see this duplication of effort directly in the CSS. We see, like we saw in the slides, a nav and then a nav unordered list, nav unordered list, list item, and it goes even further to say anchors inside list items and then hover against those anchors. This makes sense, we can read this, but as it becomes complex, it becomes more and more duplication and less obvious that they may be related. It also implies that you can put these anywhere, and the maintenance of this CSS or this less file over time would be better served with nesting. It implies to people that it change it later that they are related, so they should come together and be in the same part of the CSS file or even in their own individual CSS file. So the way we change this to the nested format is literally to go ahead and just nest it. So I'm going to take our unordered list and I'm going to put it inside the nav tag, and then I can get rid of that repeated section for the nav. Let's look at the raw generated CSS to see what this looks like. CSS, my less. So if we come down to our nav, we can see that even though they're nested, the less processor did the correct thing and it decoupled them or denormalized them into the two different calls. So the nesting isn't about the runtime, it's really about the design time experience and the maintenance of these design assets. Let's go ahead and continue this by going ahead and nesting our list item inside the unordered list, and I typically keep them nested visually as well. This is not required, it's just using the curly braces to imply the nesting, but because the indentation is there, it makes it a little easier to see the relationship between them. And then I'll actually pull the last couple of these in so we can see something that has some girth to it by continuing that nesting. Now in this case, we're really saying we just need to attach the hover here. So I'm going to use that ampersand combinator that we talked about in the slides. So this is going to take this A and make the decoration none, but then say A and the hover is going to be this piece right here, the underline. So all of these nested elements, even though it looks like one solid structure, When we go ahead and look at the generated, it's going to do the right thing and generate all 5 elements for you. And it'll also be smart about ordering them in the right way and making sure the specificity is no more than necessary. Let's do it to one more section just so we can kind of follow it through. Here's another fairly simple section, a nav inside of a footer. I'll go ahead and move it down, nest it in, and get rid of the duplication. And we can see that there, again, is this relationship between them, and that our resulting CSS is still that denormalized or decoupled version of exactly what we specified. Great, let's head back to the slides. Next, we'll talk about several features that Les uses to round out the feature set. The first one is namespaces. And the idea behind namespaces is really for organizational grouping. These don't actually get emitted out into the CSS, but allows you to reuse names in other pieces inside of a section called namespace. And this is primarily so that if you needed something like just the button class in a bunch of different areas and a bunch of different modules, you don't have to worry about doing a lot of prefixing. The My Forms allows you to use that namespace to find what you're actually looking for. It uses the greater than symbol here to say, go find the set button here inside my namespace. Scoping is another feature that's actually related to namespaces, but is used throughout less files. We've seen so far that creating variables and mix-ins and those sorts of things in less have typically been created at that global scope, at the top level of an individual less file or inside of an imported file. And that certainly works and is very, very common. There are cases, though, where you want to have the same variable or mixin created, but have it limited to only used within a certain scope. So this is an example inside of a rule for form where we're specifying a new variable called size that has a different value than the variable at the global scope. And when we use it here in our button class inside of our form, it's going to use that size based on the first one it finds inside of its scope. It's going to hide the fact that there's one at the global scope. And this can be several tiers down, especially with nested rules. There may be a size inside the button rule set that would override the one in forms that would also override the one at the global scope. So you're able to both create variables and mixins that are scoped in these ways. This is in fact how the namespacing works. The namespacing just creates a new scope that is not actually emitted as a section of CSS. It is just used to define a section of code. The next feature is string interpolation. The idea here is that you can have a string as defined in a variable. In this case, we have one called root that has this string of images. And notice I'm using slashes here because I want to use this root in assembling URLs. So here in a rule set, I can say the background is this URL, and I'm going to inject this variable into the string itself by using the @ symbol, curly brace, the name of the variable, and end curly brace. When I do this, it's going to become the slash images slash. It's going to inject the contents of that string into the other string for me. Less also supports the idea of actually using JavaScript directly in the less. This isn't that common, but there are some occasions where it can really help you. So here's an example of that root variable being defined, and then a new variable is being defined, but we're going to use JavaScript to actually do some execution. And the way this works is the back quotes you see here are used to embed what needs to be executed in JavaScript. In this case, I'm using the stringed interpolation to spit out the contents of the images and then call the JavaScript function toUpperCase to actually get an @root that is going to be slash uppercase images. So in this case, just like we saw before, we're injecting the @root here, but because we had called toUpperCase in JavaScript, the images gets uppercased for us. Now anything within the back quotes is going to be executed by a JavaScript engine. I wouldn't get too carried away and do too much crazy stuff here because you're talking about running JavaScript on the server, and that may or may not be a performance bottleneck for you. But for simple cases like uppercasing and lowercasing and maybe doing array manipulation and things like that, perfectly valid. I just wouldn't start writing whole functions or certainly doing things like AJAX calls or anything crazy. So let's go look at how these last couple of features work. So back in our project, let's go ahead and make a new namespace for a module. And I'm just going to call it the contact module to be simple. And I'll just create some curly braces around that. And then here I'll go ahead and create a new mixin called fonts. I'm not going to take any parameter, but here I'm going to take some common font information we're going to need in a couple of places. And I'll just put it in our mixin. Now instead of using the size of the font here, I want to actually just use that base size that we had specified up here up top. So by default, the base size is going to be 16. And we come down into our form and replace this with contact module greater than, and that's the namespace operator, fonts. That'll go ahead and import it into our rule here. Now, we haven't refactored this into nested rules yet, but let's go ahead and do that, since that's probably what we're going to want anyway. So bring that in, and let's go ahead and make that indented, and this text area and label we're also going to want indented, and then finally the validation we'll also want indented. And we can go ahead and get rid of those repeating sections. And so we can see pretty clearly that we have a contact form, and that inside of it we have a class for validation, a label, text area, all these things we're going to want to actually use in that way. And for our inputs, like our text box and our text area, we want to be able to specify these in a common way, and then down here some specific things that are just applied to the text area, just like you would do in CSS, but we're removing that duplication. So if we look at this in the browser, we should be able to see that font is being injected here just like we expected it to, and that it's expanding these out with the nesting the way we've seen in prior versions. So that's great. Almost. Let's go ahead and go back here, and let's talk about the idea of scope. Now, this mixin is actually used in the scope of wherever we're going to use it. So if we were to define at base size here inside of our module, you may make the assumption that this base size is going to be used here. And in fact, if we save it and update it, we'll see that it's not. We're still getting that 16 pixel from the global scope. Because what the mixins are doing are actually being executed in the scope of the rules. So if we set the base size here inside the contact form, inside of this scope, it goes ahead and uses that. Because when we inject this into the CSS, it's using the first variable it can find in its own scope. And that's why these mixins are very much like methods or functions. They're being executed exactly where they're being called. So let's take another idea here. Let's create a new variable called approot, and I'll just call it something that I may have gotten from the server, or might be some hard-coded value here. If I want to actually specify something like the background image, I'd hate to have to replace this in every case. And so what we can do is actually say at curly brace app root end curly brace, and this is going to take that value of approot and inject it in our string here. And I'll go ahead and say images background.jpg. When we look at this, we can see that it did in fact do what we wanted to. It injected that value here directly inside of our string that we output. I think of this sort of behavior much closer to something like the way I would use constants in a typical programming language. Let's head back to the slides. So let's wrap it up. we've taken a look at less as a language for doing more complex and more maintainable code inside your design assets. We've seen how we can refactor it from the CSS that we may get from designers or even CSS that we write ourselves into something that's more maintainable. Allows you to bring your developer sense to the design tools and the design operations you're going to do in doing web development. It's going to improve reuse and readability, and this becomes really crucial for larger projects as you're looking and trying to figure out why things are working in certain ways and where the grouping of rules are. When you're looking at the resulting less file, it can make more sense that, oh, these are all related because they're nested. Allows you to take the structure of your actual code, take the actual structure of your HTML and modularize your designs in those same concrete pieces. It also allows you to separate designs into multiple files so that they are modular in the same way that individual code files are modular and then brought together, whether that's through a compilation phase or a merging phase like it is in Less, at runtime. Simply put, Less is a more capable version of CSS. My name is Sean Wildermuth. Thanks for joining me.